Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Advocates LSU Sports Update. I am Advocate football beat writer Wilson Alexander, joined today by special guest, my friend Jordan Hill, covers Georgia for 24/7 Sports, kind enough to come here and talk about the SEC championship game with me. Jordan, how are you doing on this Wednesday afternoon?
Doing great, Wilson. I'm honored to pop on here, and I think I was told I'm the first opposing beat writer to pop on. So, what an honor! Means a lot.
You are. We wouldn't want anybody else to be the first one. You're our honored guest today. We wanted to bring you in to break down everything about this matchup. Obviously, number one Georgia versus number 14 LSU, 3 p.m. Central Time in Atlanta, Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Georgia is a pretty heavy favorite in this game. LSU now 9-3. The Bulldogs are obviously undefeated and seem to be pretty much a virtual lock for the playoff. But want to get before we get too far in everything, just want to throw this out. Anybody have any questions? Send them our way. Jordan and I will try to get through them as we go through the show. And as I'm asking them questions about the Bulldogs, and we're breaking down all the nitty gritty of this SEC championship. I'll start with this, Jordan. Just some background on Georgia. What has made this team so successful this season? I mean, they lost 15 draft picks, 5 defensive players in the first round, undefeated in the regular season for the second straight year. What has made this team capable of doing that?
I think it's a testament to the way this coaching staff has recruited the last few years. I mean, it's definitely, the easy comparison is always Alabama. And that's what we've seen this year. I mean, just players step up, playing bigger roles, and continuing to meet that, standard. That's the thing that gets talked about with so many Georgia players is playing to the standard. And a lot of questions about this defense, as a defense that lost 5 players that were picked in the first round of last April's draft. They come out in the very first game and only give up 3 points to what turned out to be a really good Oregon team. So I think what you saw was players step up, players playing bigger roles, guys that we thought had potential, who have stepped up and played much more significant roles. Guys like Jamon Demas Johnson, Smile Monday at inside linebacker. You keep in mind people that you brought back from last year's team that played big roles like Jalen Carter, Keely Ringo, Chris Smith. They've had such a great combination of inexperienced talent who have stepped up and played big roles and become players that could be really counted on, and also having experienced veterans that have stepped up. And then you talk about the offense too. It's a situation where they've had guys continue to make plays, and I think we lose sight sometimes the fact that Georgia's gone pretty much the entire season without their number one wide receiver. And credit to a lot of the skill players like Kenny McIntosh, the tight ends, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. They did a good job of not having AD Mitchell really affect how effective this offense is going to be. And now you have AD potentially coming back for this game, and it looks very likely if he's not back Saturday, him being back for the playoff. I mean, it takes what is already a really good offense and could help them reach the next level.
You mentioned the playoff there. I think there's maybe some hope from LSU side of things that Georgia could be looking past this game because it seems to be pretty much a virtual lock for the playoff at this point. Having heard some Georgia players this week and understanding a little bit of Georgia's history in the SEC championship game, it hasn't actually won since 2017. It seems like that's probably not the case. What have you gathered from the Georgia side of things in terms of how they're approaching this game?
Yeah, I mean, even before we got to this week, mid-November, I think Georgia had clinched the East. And we talked to Kyrus Jackson, who's been around, played on a bunch of these teams. And he said, look, we want to put numbers up on the wall, is where they indicate who won the SEC in Georgia's meeting room. And I think it does resonate. I mean, Kirby, as much success as Georgia has had under Kirby Smart, he's 1-3 in the SEC title game, hasn't won it since 2017. Couple of losses to Alabama and then the loss to that 2019 LSU team. I do think it resonates. And, a lot of the players have been asked about it this week. These are guys that have never been a part of an SEC championship team. And I thought it was funny. I went back through my notes. I went back to the very first day of spring practice, March 15th. Talked to Warren Erickson and just talked about the pressure. Is the pressure off now that you guys won the national championship? And the point he brought up was, look, we didn't win the SEC last year. We did not accomplish one of our main goals going into any year. So I totally understand LSU fans who, are kind of wishful thinking and saying, well, maybe this team is looking ahead. And we could get into Saturday and see kind of a lethargic performance from Georgia. But based on everything we've heard from the team and also Kirby Smart as well, I think they understand that there is something that really means a lot to winning the SEC, particularly with the fact that Georgia hasn't played very well in this game the last few times they've been in it.
Now, another word there that you threw out is lethargic, and there has been times this year that Georgia has kind of sleepwalked a little bit. This isn't a unit last year that dominated everybody it played except for Alabama in that SEC title game. Missouri, it struggled to put. It almost got upset. It took a fourth quarter comeback to win at Missouri. Kind of messed around with Kent State, and then Kentucky, after trying to go for it on 4th and 1 at the goal line up 16-0 and not being able to get it, that ends up becoming an interesting game in the fourth quarter. Why has that been the case?
Well, I think it's a situation where in some of those games, you just kind of know the competition. I mean, you look at Kent State, and we all thought, Georgia's going to be able to name their score, and they played a little sloppy on defense. They turned the ball over, I think 3 turnovers in probably the first 17 minutes of that game. They just left themselves vulnerable. Really, in those 2 first games that I would say were legitimate scares, or at least closer than we all expected, Kent State and Missouri, the issue was turning the ball over. And the last 2 weeks, beating Kentucky 16-6, beating Georgia Tech 37-13 or 37-14, it were situations where it wasn't the prettiest. It was a couple of situations where you didn't go, wow, they really look like the number one team. But it was just really 2 games, these last 2 ones, where third, fourth quarter, they just dominated. I mean, against Georgia Tech, they only gave up a yard in the third quarter to completely put that game away. Kentucky, they had held Kentucky in check all the way up to that 4th and goal that you mentioned. And, I thought at the time I was okay with that call to try to go for it rather than make it a 3-possession game with a field goal, because I thought Kentucky hasn't moved the ball at all. You're going to tell me they're going to put together a 99-yard drive? Well, Will Levis did exactly that. So, it's sort of hard to really diagnose what the issue has been in some of these games. But to their credit, in some of the bigger games they played, specifically that Tennessee game, they only win that by 2 touchdowns. But I don't think anyone watching that thought that was a 2-touchdown game. I think that they understand what this team is capable of and the caliber of this team. Maybe sometimes they get caught kind of looking ahead or understanding the level of the competition they play. But, it's kind of one of those things where you kind of have to be ticky-tacky if you want to break down a team that went 12-0, because getting to that point, especially in the SEC, it's hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, first team since Florida in 08-09 in the SEC to put together back-to-back undefeated SEC, 8-0, go 8-0 in the SEC back-to-back seasons. LSU is definitely trying to nitpick whatever it can in that undefeated season just to see if there's any advantages. But one of the biggest things that's tough to deal with Georgia is obviously at tight end Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington. They also have, as LSU fans know, former tight end Eric Gilbert. He hasn't really played this year. It's really Bruce Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington. Brian Kelly thinks really highly of both of them, as does really everybody in the country. He was asked specifically about Darnell, just the fact that he's 6'7", on Monday, and said that LSU is probably going to have to use some bracket coverage, maybe some zone, because one-on-one, it's hard to defend a guy like that. Is there anything that has really worked against these tight ends and what they do in the passing game?
Not that I'm aware of, and I'm sure Matt House and that staff have been combing through film and trying to figure it out. There have been games where they have not been necessarily the focal point, but I really think the way Georgia, we haven't seen Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington have, outrageous numbers, especially the second half of the season. And I think that's to Georgia's benefit. We were coming into this year with the amount of talent they had at tight end, and even too, another guy we haven't mentioned is a true freshman, Oscar Delp. He's played from time to time, but this is a guy that's kind of getting overshadowed. He's a 4-star, so it just shows you the talent at tight end. But we came into the year thinking, could we see a lot of 3 tight end sets? How are they going to get all these guys the ball? They've done a good job of keeping these guys involved. There's been a lot of 2 tight end sets with Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington, and using them really effectively as run blockers, because both those guys are outstanding blocking tight ends on top of being able to catch the ball. But the fact that they have not really worn those guys into the ground as far as a lot of targets, a lot of receptions, and potentially having to worry about them and what they got left in the tank going into the postseason. I think that sets Georgia up well if they get into any of these games, even starting with Saturday. If there's a shootout or if there's a game where they really need a drive late or they need someone they can count on. I mean, Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington both have really established themselves as guys they can count on. And, again, I don't know if we're going to see a lot of targets out of those guys. I really thought in the Kentucky game that maybe we would see them really heavily targeted. It wasn't necessarily the case, but knowing that they're there is huge. And again, if they get AD Mitchell, that kind of puts a little bit of pressure off those guys. But if they really, really need a drive and they really need a play, you can bet they're going to look at either number 19 or number 0 and try to get them the ball.
For any LSU fans who aren't aware, I mean, Brock Bowers has been used on some end rounds this year. He has a couple of rushing touchdowns. There was a point early in the season, I think after the South Carolina game, where I thought, I might vote for him for Heisman. That's probably not going to be the case now. But in terms of just pure talent, he is clearly one of the best players in the country. One thing I want to dive into, though, and just as an aside, that's a place that LSU wants to get to at tight end eventually with what they have in the room. They're hoping to get sort of built up like that. One thing that when we talk about nitty gritty of the matchup, I think that maybe actually could be an advantage for LSU. I want to get your opinion on this. Is red zone. Georgia is actually 48th in the red zone in terms of touchdowns scored this year. They're first overall, but they've kicked a lot of field goals, had to settle quite a bit. It seems like maybe sometimes an issue of not being able to just overpower an opponent by running the football, or just some pass plays that aren't really maybe exactly what they're just kind of falling complete, and there's some issues in that area. And it turns out LSU was actually second best in the country behind Georgia in terms of touchdown percentage allowed in the red zone heading into the Texas A&M game. It's now 7th, which is still pretty good. Is this actually maybe an advantage that LSU could have in this game, the way that Georgia has kind of scuffled around in the red zone this year?
I think it's definitely an area if, we look at this game on Sunday and we say, oh, this game was close, and you tell me, how was it close? I would say, well, I bet Georgia struggled in the red zone. It has been an issue. It's been really hot and cold. It was like Georgia started the year doing really well, which, they scored 49 against Oregon. Pretty much everything went right in that game. But there were periods like that Missouri game where they were having to settle for field goals and just trying to stay alive. Saw it again in the Kentucky game, most notably with that 4th and goal that they weren't able to put in the end zone. The thing that interests me going into this game, if it comes to the red zone, is sort of the attitude and where this Georgia offensive line is. Because I asked Warren McClendon, the right tackle, earlier this week, just about what was the issue, and he talked about that the offensive line has really challenged itself the last few weeks, saying we got to be more physical. We cannot be out physicaled in some of these games. And to their credit, they've run the ball really well the last 2 weeks. Kenny McIntosh, to me, it might be the X factor for Georgia going into the postseason, even past the SEC championship game, if they do in fact make the playoff, because of the way that he can get the ball in so many different ways. But the offensive line seems to be really confident and really, taking pride in being able to finish in the red zone. And I think it's something that they understand has not been to the standard they need, especially if they make the playoffs. Some of these offenses they could face, Michigan, USC, TCU, they can't afford to kick field goals. So I would say that, yes, that's an area that, to me, if this game winds up being close, it's probably because we saw a little bit too much Jack Podlesny out there kicking and not enough, being able to punch the ball in the end zone.
What else would we have to say sitting there on Sunday would have to happen for LSU to just keep the game close in the fourth quarter and have a chance, or even spring the upset altogether? It feels like maybe turnovers. You mentioned how Stetson Bennett has a tendency sometimes to get a little reckless and take some shots downfield. But I mean, Georgia's turnover margin's -2. On the flip side, LSU's done a really good job of holding on to the ball, but that's kind of a double-edged sword because sometimes Shaden Daniels has been hesitant. Is it turnovers? Is there something else where you say, okay, if this happens, LSU's in the game late, maybe even wins?
The two things I would start with turnovers, because specifically with that Kent State game and with the Missouri game, really early turnovers in both of those first halves that not only obviously in your possessions, but it gives the opponent the ball, and it kind of had Georgia playing from behind, specifically in that Missouri game, and you needed pretty much all 4 quarters to survive that game. Then on the other side, which I'm intrigued to see with the LSU offense, it's if Georgia gives up explosive plays, because based on what I've read and what I've seen, it doesn't seem like the Tigers have been able to generate a lot of explosive plays. But when Georgia has got itself in trouble, it's been not these long drives. Characteristically, it's not long drives. It's a play where someone gets 65 yards and all of a sudden they're at the 20. And then, maybe Georgia kind of buckles down, forces a field goal. But if LSU is able to create a bunch of those plays, catch guys off guard, again, a talented defense, but still a lot of guys going through this stuff for the very first time. Guys like Malachi Starks, he's never played an SEC title game before, and other guys who will be playing who have not been playing that much. Defensively, to me, that is the area where Georgia could find itself in trouble if they give up some of those explosive plays and if they're not able to rush the passer, because it's kind of been hit or miss. You lose outside linebacker Nolan Smith. That's a huge hole that they've been able to kind of fill a bit. But you can't replace Nolan Smith. So if they're not able to get after the quarterback and really affect the pocket for LSU, it could be a real window for the Tigers to make this thing interesting.
Well, they're not really adept at explosive plays. That's kind of when you think about like why LSU maybe isn't a great matchup in this game. Try to take down Georgia's because they tend to have these really long, methodical drives. A lot of times it's 75 yards plus. They actually rank in the bottom half of the country in 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60-plus yard plays. Georgia, I think, as we've seen, has actually – I don't know, it's kind of all over the place in terms of explosives, but maybe is a little bit more effective in breaking off some big ones. So LSU would have to certainly kind of turn around its tendencies in order for that to happen. And a big piece of that is going to come down to Jaden Daniels. For LSU fans, he is, as of Monday, was still in a walking boot. We haven't gotten an update from Brian Kelly. We'll talk to him tomorrow, as well as Kirby Smart on another sort of teleconference, when we'll get kind of the last update on Jaden before game day. All indications are that he's going to play. He had to do a minor ankle test on Tuesday before practice to make sure he could kind of lift off of his toes, test the strength of that ankle that was injured late in the Texas A&M game in order to practice Tuesday and kind of go from there. I'd be surprised if he doesn't play. Georgia seems like they're anticipating that he'll play as well. Has Georgia – Jaden's kind of LSU fans have mixed opinions of him this season because there's been a stretch where he really played well between Florida and Alabama. There's been other times he's been kind of up and down. He's put up a lot of yards, but has this hesitancy to push the ball downfield. Has Georgia really played a quarterback like him? Or I mean, Hendon Hooker kind of comes to mind as someone who's obviously really good, and Georgia shut him down. Would there be any sort of reason for Georgia to fear Jaden Daniels, or what would they kind of have to game plan with him?
Well, I think there is the understanding that he can make those big plays, and Zion Logue talked about that earlier in the week. He kind of compared him to Robbie Ashford, although basically saying that probably a better version of Robbie Ashford there at Auburn. But it's been a situation as far as guys that can move like Jaden. It's been mostly what Georgia's faced this year, other than like Will Levis at Kentucky. For the most part, these guys that Georgia has played have that ability to escape the pocket, or at the very least extend plays and kind of force defenses to stay on top of their game. And time after time, Georgia's done a really good job. So I think it's going to be a situation. I would be really intrigued if Jaden doesn't go the whole way, if we see something else as far as him being limited, what that would look like, because Zion Logue was asked about that earlier this week, and he was basically like, well, that's the first I've heard of that he's dealing with a walking boot and working his way back. But yeah, I think there's an understanding that Jaden could generate plays, and it's been a situation again where Georgia's been really good on the very few opportunities they've allowed. When teams have been able to make plays, they find a way to bounce right back, getting stops, forcing field goals, or just forcing outright punts. It's going to be a challenge for this defense, but it's certainly not going to be one that they are new to this year.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what Georgia comes out in defensively, because it feels like a formula has kind of emerged in a way to sort of contain Jaden Daniels, which is basically rush 3 or 4, and Georgia's seems capable of being able to just rush 4, get after the passer a little bit, and drop everybody else into coverage. Teams like Arkansas and A&M used a spy at times to keep Jaden from escaping the pocket, and that ended up being pretty effective. Is this defensive front capable of just kind of rushing 4 and getting after the quarterback?
I think so. It is something to watch because they have struggled at times. But really, when you look at the games where they absolutely needed it, they came through. Florida game, Tennessee, they had Hendon Hooker all over the place. Think about Jalen Carter hitting him in the end zone for what looked like it was probably going to be a safety, and Tennessee catches a break on that. But it is something to watch because, again, they don't have Nolan Smith. They don't have a guy that not only is he so talented, but he's been around for quite a while. And playing out on a stage like the SEC Championship is nothing new. They're going to need guys like Robert Bill, who's been around a lot, played a lot last year after Adam Anderson left the team and played really well, wound up leading the team in sacks. Need guys like Michael Williams, who's a true freshman who has shown flashes but still probably lacks that consistency. They need those guys to be able to affect that type of that piece of the puzzle and that part of the game. Because I think on the whole, in the second half of the season, they've done a very good job as far as rushing the passer. But there have been games where it's been very much lacking, and I don't think they can afford that if they're going to go into this game on Saturday and think it's going to be easy.
Now, one more thing before we kind of let you go is you mentioned A.D. Mitchell earlier. He's missed most of the season, but like you said, Georgia's pretty clear-cut number one receiver, either I guess him or Ladd McConkey, who could be. Yeah, I guess he played a little bit in the Tech game, at least maybe a snap or two. Where's he at, and what does that do for the offense and Stetson Bennett as a result if he's able to play and be full go?
Yeah, we got to see him warm up before that Georgia Tech game. And truthfully, Wilson didn't look like there was any limitations at all. He runs out of the tunnel. He's jumping around. And I'm like, okay, this guy may go out here and play 15, 20 snaps. He's only really out there for one play, and then they call a timeout and don't actually run the play he's out there for. Every indication that I've got is that he'll be able to go. Now, we'll see how much he plays. They might decide, we need to keep him on a pitch count and understand that we have a bigger picture as long as they can win on Saturday and obviously move on to the playoff. But I think that's huge if AD is able to come back, whether it's on Saturday or later if we get into the playoff, because he creates so much separation. And that's something that at times Georgia has struggled with in the games where they have not thrown the ball well. It's just as easy as getting guys open. And sometimes that's not happened with some of the receivers. They've had guys step up. Ladd McConkey's definitely been their top wide receiver and had guys like Kieris Jackson and Dominic Blaylock make plays along the way. But it's no secret that this offense isn't at its full potential because A.D. Mitchell has only played something like 5 snaps. He played against Auburn, but really didn't do very much. But going all the way back to the second game of the year, he gets hurt on the very first offensive play against Samford and pretty much has not played since then. So he's somebody to watch. And I hate to say it for the LSU fans watching, but if number 5's out there, especially early in this game, it's not going to help LSU's chances.
Well, Jordan, what's your prediction? What are you feeling on this game? If you don't want to throw out a score, that's okay. But what's your read as a few days out here from kickoff on how this goes?
I'm going Georgia 34-14. I do think that this could be a pretty competitive first half. I could see this being a situation where Georgia is kind of trying to find itself and understanding, too, that LSU can make plays. But I think ultimately this Bulldogs team is too good. I think probably by midway through the third quarter, they're going to pull away. And again, I mentioned it earlier, but Kenny McIntosh is the guy that I would recommend people really keep an eye on. Had a great game against Georgia Tech, coming off of a very good performance against Kentucky. Had an 83-yard catch against Georgia Tech last week. He really seems like he is hitting the high gear at the most important time in the year. And they have ran the ball well, and I wouldn't be surprised if they really look at how Texas A&M attacked LSU last week and say we're going to really try to ground and pound this game. So I think Kenny's going to have a big game. I think we'll see those tight ends be able to make some plays as well, and I think Georgia moves on, goes into the playoff with an undefeated record.
Yeah, I kind of have a similar feeling about it. It will be interesting if LSU keeps the game close at halftime because these are sort of two second-half teams. LSU has been really good in the second half this year with the defensive adjustments that Matt House has made. But Georgia is a little bit of a different beast with a roster that is much more stocked and deeper than LSU's is at this point just because Kirby has had that thing rolling for the last 6 years in terms of recruiting, obviously. And that's why they are still in the position they were in after winning a national championship and losing 15 draft picks. So we'll see it all play out on Saturday. Jordan, tell the people where they can find you.
Absolutely. Dawgs247.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Jordan Davis Hill or at Dawgs247. So all kinds of content. We've got the Junkyard Dogcast podcast with all our previews for Saturday. So very busy time of the year, but very exciting one, and looking forward to seeing what this looks like on Saturday.
Absolutely. For LSU fans, we'll have you covered over at theadvocate.com and NOLA.com. You can sign up for our newsletter in your email inbox and join us here. I guess we'll have to kind of see what our postseason schedule looks like in terms of shows. Now that obviously next week there won't be a game. But you can, again, find us over at the website, As always, we'll have you covered from Atlanta for the SEC Championship, 3 p.m. Central Time on Saturday. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Jordan, for joining me. For everybody over at The Advocate, I'm Wilson Alexander. Have a great rest of your week.